The sun was blazing like it was trying to burn through this quiet suburban neighborhood. The air shook with heat, and the pool in the center of the apartment complex looked like an escape from the fiery inferno. Jaden stood at the edge, about to jump into the cool water where his friends were already splashing. But even here, amidst the laughter and splashing, he felt something wrong. A police car stood still in the parking lot nearby. It seemed to disappear into the shadows of the trees, but Jaden knew he was being watched. He caught himself involuntarily looking in that direction, feeling the cold stare like an icy drop running down his back. "Hey, what are you standing there for? Jump already," his friend Malik shouted, bursting into laughter. Jaden smiled and pretended not to notice, but something was stirring inside. When he finally dove in, the world stood still. For a moment, only the hiss of bubbles and the soft caress of the water distracted him from the heavy feeling that something was wrong. As he surfaced, he heard scraps of conversation from the adults on the neighboring lounge chairs. "It's always those, wandering around everywhere. Who let them in here anyway?" Jaden turned around. It wasn't about him, but it was enough to make his body tense. He was used to these words, these innuendos. Adults thought children couldn't hear, but he always did. In the distance, near the entrance to the complex, an unfamiliar man flashed by. His white t-shirt and work boots did not match the relaxed atmosphere of the pool. He stopped, shoved his hands in his pockets, and stood staring intently at the teenagers. "Hey, Jade? Who's that?" his friend Leah asked, looking in the same direction. Jaden shrugged, but the feeling of unease increased. He knew this place wasn't one where he could completely relax. The pool was open to all residents, but the rules here always seemed strange. For some, they didn't exist, and for others, they were suddenly too much. He glanced again at the police car. Now it seemed that the figure inside was moving. A second later, the door opened slightly, but no one came out. Jaden wiped his face with his hand, thinking that maybe he was just imagining it. But the look of the neighborhood was like a shadow. He always felt like she was watching him. And while this day could have been perfect, with every passing moment, Jaden sensed that the quiet of this hot Saturday was deceiving. Something was looming, something that was impossible to ignore. The midday sun was blazing mercilessly, and the light breeze seemed unable to break through the dense heat. The pool was an oasis, but even here the calm seemed deceptive, like a fragile glass ball about to shatter. Jaden sat at the edge of the water, mindlessly rubbing the laces on his sneakers. He felt something heavy slide across his skin, like a shadow, a glance. A patrol car slowly drove by. The noise of the engine seemed to drown out all other sound. The radio in the car crackled, but the driver's side window was down, and Jaden felt a stare that was both icy and bone-chilling. The policeman, a middle-aged man with sharp features, was looking straight at him. It was as if his eyes were saying, "You're out of place." Jaden looked away, feeling the blood rush to his face. He pretended he hadn't noticed, but inside he was boiling. Why did he always have to feel this way? Why did his mere presence seem so annoying to others? "Hey, is everything okay?" Leah sat down next to him, nudging him lightly with her shoulder. She noticed Jaden tense up. He nodded, but couldn't take his ears off the sound of a car that suddenly stopped a little farther away, on the corner. The officer continued to stare, now making no secret of his disapproval. Jaden heard Leah whisper, "Why is he just looking at us?" "It's not like we're doing anything." "Get used to it," he replied, trying to sound nonchalant. But everything inside was seething. The officer finally got out of the car, straightening up and walking toward the pool. His steps were slow, as if he were deliberately dragging out the moment to maximize the effect. Jaden saw the other visitors, mostly white families, involuntarily tense up, but when the officer passed them, they relaxed, realizing that they weren't the target. "Hey, kid." His voice was husky, tinged with a barely concealed distaste. He didn't speak loudly, but each sound cut the air like a blade. Jaden looked up. The cop stopped right in front of him. His gaze swept over Jaden, from his wet shorts to his sneakers, as if he were looking for something to hold on to. "Do you live here?" "Yes," Jaden replied, trying to stay calm. "Got any proof?" "Proof?" Jaden squinted, his voice trembling slightly, but he quickly pulled himself together. "I live in apartment 3B. Ask security if you want it." "You've got a lot of new faces around here," the officer piped in, glancing dismissively at the other teens by the pool. There was clearly an undertone in his voice. "If something is bothering you, you can talk to my parents," Jaden said, feeling his throat constrict. "With your parents?" The officer grinned, baring his teeth in an imaginary smile. "You better remember, kid, this is no place for trouble." Jaden clenched his fists, his breathing getting heavier. He knew he couldn't let himself get angry. Not here, not now. The cop was watching him, as if testing to see how much he could take. The officer stepped back, but his gaze remained, like an invisible mark. "Why is he doing that?" Malik asked, stepping closer. Jaden wanted to say that it was okay, that nothing terrible had happened, but he couldn't. All he could do was watch the cop walk back to the car. His hands were shaking, but not from fear, from rage. As the car started up again, slowly moving away, Jaden sensed that this wasn't the end. That alien gaze, penetrating and threatening, was only the beginning. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from, and whether you've had something similar happen in your life. Your thoughts and experiences will help make this conversation even more important and profound. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of this story and other exciting stories. And now, we continue. The air seemed to thicken as the police car reappeared on the horizon. Jaden watched it slowly pull up to the pool, and he felt his inner tension turn into a cramp in his stomach. Just now, he'd been trying to relax, listening to his friends laughing, but now the whole world had narrowed down to that menacing metal silhouette again. The car door opened with a sharp click, like a pistol shot, and out stepped the same officer. This time he was holding a notebook that looked more like a gun than an instrument for taking notes. His face was deliberately stern, and his gaze, cold and hard, swept over Jaden and his friends like a scanner. "So, guys," he began, approaching slowly, "are you still here?" His voice was even, but he clearly read sarcasm in it. "Anyone want to tell me what you're doing here?" "We're just resting," Jaden replied calmly, rising from the chaise lounge. His friends froze, the tension in the air almost palpable. "Resting?" the officer interjected, raising his eyebrows. "You know, someone called me and said there was noise, a mess. You're kind of inconveniencing the other tenants." "That's not true," Jaden replied, trying to sound confident. "True or not, kid, that's not for you to decide," the officer interrupted him, taking a step closer. "I'm here to keep order, not to listen to your explanations." Leah tried to interject. "We weren't doing anything, we were just swimming. No one complained." The officer threw her a look full of contempt and smiled mockingly. "And you're a lawyer then? Calm down, little girl. Grown-ups talk." Those words silenced everyone. Leah clenched her fists but said nothing. Jaden saw Malik lower his head, avoiding the officer's eyes. "So," the policeman continued, giving them all a look, "do you have papers here? A license that you have the right to use this pool? Or maybe you just decided to get in here because you thought it was free entertainment?" "We live here," Jaden tried to explain again, feeling the anger rising inside him. "We have keys to the gate. We pay rent." "Really? Then where are your family members? Or do you think you can hang out here unsupervised?" His voice grew colder, his words full of distrust. "Why are you talking to us like that?" Jaden finally asked. His voice shook slightly, but he continued to look the officer in the eye. "I talk as I see fit, kid," the policeman replied sharply. "You know, I think you ask too many questions. Did somebody teach you that?" Jaden felt the heat flood his face, but he held back. Every muscle in his body wanted to scream, to object, but he knew how that would end. Instead, he took a deep breath and said, "We haven't violated anything." The policeman leaned closer so Jaden could smell his cheap cologne. "It's up to me whether you were trespassing or not. I've given you a warning. If I hear one more noise from your company, you and I will have a different conversation." He turned abruptly and headed back to the car, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence. It was only as he drove away that Jaden realized he'd clenched his hands so tightly that his fingernails dug into his palms. "This isn't normal," Leah said quietly. "I know," Jaden replied, feeling anger and fear fighting within him. But he knew one thing. This was not the end, just the beginning. It was late afternoon when the police car appeared at the pool for the third time. It moved faster this time, as if the officer had lost patience. Jaden, sitting at the water's edge, saw it from a distance and immediately felt his breathing quicken. He knew something was going to happen, something that would change this day forever. The car door swung open and the same officer got out, but now his movements were sharp and aggressive. His face was flushed and his eyes burned with rage, as if he was only looking for an excuse to vent his anger. In his hand, he clutched something that looked like a radio, but his grip was so strong that it looked as if the device was about to break. "Well, I told you to be quiet," he shouted, his voice echoing around the set. "But you don't seem to understand the simple rules." Jaden stood up slowly, feeling his friends huddle behind him. Everyone else, families, parents with children, froze in the shadows of the chaise lounges, afraid to move. "We didn't do anything wrong," Jaden said. His voice was firm, but inside he could feel every nerve in him being stretched to the limit. The officer took a few steps forward, stopping so close that there was no more than a meter between them. He slowly ran his gaze over Jaden, as if studying him from head to toe. "What? You think you're the boss around here?" He grinned evilly. "You think you can do whatever you want just because your mommy's a prosecutor?" "What do you want us to do?" Leah intervened, but her voice was full of fear. The officer turned to her with an expression of utter contempt. "Shut your mouth, girl. You weren't asked." The words hit them like a hammer. Leah was silent, and Jaden felt his fists clench again. But before he could respond, the officer continued. "You all think you can just climb wherever you want, but I'll show you what happens when you don't listen." And that's when things got out of hand. The officer pulled some wires out of the car, long, black, with metal clips on the ends. The people around them shrieked. Someone tried to get up, but no one dared to come closer. "You want to feel what order feels like?" he barked, turning to Jaden. "Don't do it," shouted Malik, standing up beside his friend. It's dangerous." But the officer was no longer listening. There was only rage in his eyes. He threw the wires sharply toward the pool, where the water sparked instantly, giving out a loud crackling sound. The water in the pool hissed, and the children who were still in it rushed to the edges, screaming, trying to get out. Jaden froze. For a split second, panic gripped him, and everything around him seemed to freeze. He saw his friends reaching for him, his parents rising from their deck chairs, shouting something to the officer, but their words were drowned out by the noise. "What are you doing?" Jaden finally shouted, but there was no more fear in his voice, just pure rage. "I'm doing my job," the officer replied coldly, slowly stepping back, but his gaze was still fixed on Jaden. Helplessness covered the teenagers like a heavy blanket. No one knew what to do. No one could believe this was really happening. Panic was growing all around, but for Jaden, it all boiled down to one question: how do we stop this madness before it's too late? That day, which was supposed to be just a hot summer day, had turned into a nightmare they would never forget. And Jaden knew it would be different now. The hissing of water filled with electric sparks drowned out everything around him. The people on the platform were shouting, trying to say something, but Jaden couldn't hear them. He stood at the edge of the pool, frozen like a statue, staring at the water that was now a death trap. His heart was beating so hard he could hear it pounding in his ears. He was just about to take a step back when he felt something change. A current ran through the water and it vibrated, causing him to step back. But at the same moment he realized his friends remained in the water. "Malik! Leah!" he shouted, but his voice sounded muffled, as if all sound was drowned in white noise. They clung to the sides, trying to get out. Malik managed to grab the edge and crawl out, but Leah remained in the water, her face contorted with terror. I can't," she screamed, trying to pull herself up, but her arms were slipping. Jaden instinctively took a step toward her, but suddenly he heard an angry laugh. The officer stood nearby, watching with an expression of utter contempt. "What? Scary hero," he shouted, directing his words straight at Jaden. "Or can't you just decide whether to save her or not? You know this is your fault, right? If you'd just acted normal, none of this would have happened." "Stop it! Help her!" Jaden shouted, but the officer only grinned. "Why should I? You drove yourself here, boy," he said with emphasized disdain, slowly stepping closer. "Look at you, standing there, shivering. There's nothing you can do, is there? Just another useless coward." The words stabbed into Jaden like a knife. Fury flooded his face, but he knew that any sudden movement would make things worse. The officer knew that and was enjoying the situation. The witnesses on the platform shouted at the policeman, begging him to stop, but he paid no attention to them. Leah, still in the water, was crying, her hands slipping harder and harder. "What? Now you're quiet?" The officer continued, looking at Jaden mockingly. "You're all smart, aren't you? Love to argue. And now what? Where's your courage?" Jaden clenched his fists, his body shaking. He knew he couldn't just stand there. He needed to do something, but fear held him fast. He looked around, and his gaze met Malik's. "You can do it," Malik whispered, struggling to catch his breath. The words snapped Jaden out of his trance. He rushed to Leah, ignoring the officer's laughter and the shouts of the crowd. He knelt down and held out his hand. "Hang in there, Leah. You can do it." She reached for him with all her might. Their hands met, but slipped. The water sparked, and Jaden felt a light discharge, but he didn't pull away. "Come on," he shouted, squeezing her wrist. With one mighty tug, he pulled her out of the water. She fell on top of him, trembling, her face wet with tears as well as water. But even that moment of relief was short-lived. "Well, congratulations," came the officer's voice. "You did something right, for once. But that doesn't mean you're a hero, kid. You're just another one of those guys who keeps causing trouble." Jaden looked at him, his eyes blazing with anger. "You have no right to treat us like this," he said, trying to make his voice sound firm. "Oh, I have rights, boy." The officer stepped closer, his face a few inches from Jaden's. "And I'll show you what the law means." It was a moment when fear, anger, and humiliation intertwined. But Jaden realized one thing. This wasn't the end. The fight was just beginning. Jaden sat on the hot concrete edge of the pool, his hands shaking like he'd just run a marathon. Leah sat next to him, sobbing quietly, and Malik stood a little to the side, looking around at the crowd, who still couldn't take their eyes off the officer. The cop stood next to the car, with a look of absolute superiority, as if he'd just caught criminals instead of humiliating children. Jaden couldn't wait any longer. He reached for his cell phone. "Who are you going to call, boy?" the officer asked mockingly, noticing the movement. "You think your call is going to make a difference?" "You're going to regret this," Jaden muttered, his voice shaking, but he tried to sound confident. He dialed his mother's number. The call was short. Her voice, stern and clear, changed immediately when she heard the alarm in her son's voice. She didn't ask any unnecessary questions. "I'm on my way," she said and hung up. 20 minutes later, a silver car appeared in the parking lot next to the pool. It was a woman in a business suit, her hair neatly gathered, her face calm, but her eyes ice cold. It was Jaden's mother, a prosecutor with a reputation for not being intimidated. The crowd parted as she approached. Her steps were quick, confident. The policeman immediately tensed when he saw her, his smug expression fading slightly. What happened here? Her voice was steady, but there was a tinge of steel in it. She looked first at her son, then at the officer. "Your children." The officer began, but she gestured him to stop. "I'm not talking to you," she cut off and turned to Jaden. "Tell me everything from the beginning." Jaden told the story, his voice full of anger, but his mother listened intently, not interrupting. When he finished, she turned to the officer. "Okay, now your version," she said, folding her arms across her chest. "Ma'am, I was just doing my job," he began, trying to appear calm. "Your son and his friends were acting inappropriately, making noise, disturbing the other tenants. I had to intervene." "Behave inappropriately?" Her voice became sharper. "Disturbing the tenants? And how does that explain your choice to throw live wires into the pool where the children were?" The officer faltered slightly. "It was a way to show them that this place wasn't for rioting," he muttered. "Your actions put people's lives in mortal danger." She took a step closer, her eyes drilling him. "Do you have witnesses to corroborate your claim of disorderly conduct?" The policeman looked around, but most people averted their eyes, not wanting to be drawn into the conflict. However, one woman in the crowd, an elderly lady with a short haircut, stepped forward. "That boy wasn't doing anything wrong," she said. "He was just resting. This officer clearly wanted to humiliate them." Jaden's mother nodded at her, but turned back to the officer. "I'll give you one chance to explain. Why did you, as a representative of the law, decide to use violence instead of dialogue? The officer tried to object to something, but her professionalism and cold determination broke his confidence. He started to justify himself, talking about his job, about the rules, but his words sounded hollow. "I demand that this incident be documented immediately," she said, pulling out her phone. "I am summoning independent observers, and you will stand trial. Have you heard about the consequences of abuse of authority? About office audits? I will personally ensure that you are fully punished." The officer froze. The crowd around him began to whisper, people pulling out their phones, recording what was happening. "You don't understand," he began, but she interrupted him. "I understand perfectly. You used your power to threaten and humiliate my son, to demonstrate power in front of the children, and it will not go unpunished." There was so much confidence in her voice that even the witnesses were relieved. The officer, realizing that the situation was no longer in his hands, frowned, but remained silent. For Jaden, it was the moment he saw how injustice could be laid bare. He knew there was more to come, the trials, the interrogations, but one thing was certain: his mother wouldn't stop. Let's pause for one more quick pause. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from, and whether you've had something similar happen in your life. Your thoughts and experiences are important to us, and they help make our stories even more meaningful. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of this story and other exciting episodes. And now we continue. After the crowd began to disperse, Jaden and his mother remained by the pool, surrounded by a few witnesses who lingered to tell what they had seen. People were talking excitedly, their voices shaking with anger and fear. "I recorded the whole thing on my phone," said a young woman with a baby in her arms, holding out her cell phone. "It's crazy that he could do that." Jaden's mother took the device, her face unruffled, but her eyes scrutinized the video. The footage clearly showed the officer throwing the wires into the pool, his words filled with venom and contempt. "This is important," she said, handing the phone back. "Are you willing to provide this as evidence?" The woman nodded, though her face expressed alarm. "He looked like he wanted someone to get hurt," she whispered. Other witnesses also began to talk. One elderly neighbor admitted that the officer had caused problems before. "This man, he's picked on young guys a few times before, especially if they don't look like locals," she said. "What do you mean they don't look like it?" Jaden's mother asked, raising an eyebrow. The neighbor looked away, but then, gathering her wits, replied, "He's always talking about skin color, about how people like them shouldn't be here." The words made the air around him seem to freeze. Even Jaden, who had been ready to hear the worst, felt the anger rise in his chest again. The next morning, Jaden's mother went to the police station. Her footsteps rumbled down the corridor as she entered the building. The receptionist at the front desk, seeing her determined look, quickly set aside his papers. "I need to speak to the station manager," she said, her voice cold and confident. She was ushered into the office of the supervisor, an elderly man with a tired face. He was clearly not happy about her visit. "Ma'am, I realize the situation is complicated, but we're already investigating," he said without looking her in the eye. "Complicated," she interjected, her voice a tone lower, but that made it even more threatening. "Your employee put children's lives in mortal danger. That's not a complex situation. It's a felony." The warden sighed, folding his hands on the table. "Ma'am, let's be honest. We understand your position, but this officer is a respected employee. He has years of service under his belt." And how many years has he been using that uniform to oppress people he doesn't think deserve to be here? She asked sharply. Her words caused the supervisor visible irritation. He started to justify himself, citing bureaucratic procedures, internal checks, but she interrupted him. I've talked to witnesses. I have video showing that he intentionally threw wires into the pool. I have evidence that he systematically humiliated and intimidated children. And if you think I'm going to let this slide, you're wrong. The warden fell silent. His face became tense. We're not going to gloss over anything, he finally replied, but his tone betrayed otherwise. Later that day, Jaden and his mother sat at home, going through documents and testimonies. Each time they found something new, Jaden saw his mother become more and more focused. He's been involved in this sort of thing before, she said, looking at the reports. Latent complaints, allegations that didn't make it to court. They always found a way to dismiss the case. So, what now? Jaden asked. She lifted her gaze and looked at him. They won't shut that down now, she replied. They think they can cover their own, but this time they're going to have to respond. Jaden felt a surge of determination. He realized that his mother was not only sticking up for him, but fighting for all those who had encountered the officer and were left defenseless. However, the system began to press on. The next morning, 2 police officers visited their home and tried to politely hint that it was best to leave things as they were. Jaden saw his mother holding firm, but inside he sensed that this battle would be difficult. She opened the door and said quietly, I'm not afraid of your system. I'm a prosecutor, and I know how it works. Now go away. But the unsettling feeling remained. This was the beginning of a long war, and Jaden realized that there would be more obstacles ahead. Jaden's mother sat at her desk, littered with printouts, legal documents, and witness statements. The lamp cast a harsh light, highlighting the tense lines on her face. She knew the truth was on her side, but her gut told her that her opponents weren't sitting idly by either. The system she'd spent years defending as a prosecutor was now working against her family. It wasn't just a case, it was a war. That same evening, she received a notice. The letter informed her that Jaden was suspected of disorderly conduct and threatening a police officer. The document was accompanied by an official statement describing how Jaden had allegedly behaved aggressively at the pool, provoked the officer, and attempted to assault him. She couldn't believe her eyes. The entire text was a blatant lie, but the way it was worded showed that a skilled manipulator was behind it. Jaden, seeing the paper, felt panic take over his entire body. They want to make me look like a criminal, he said, his voice trembling. They want to make me look guilty. His mother put her hand on his shoulder, but her gaze was fixed on the document. They are afraid of the truth, she replied. And they know the truth will destroy them. So they resort to lies. But that's their mistake. The next morning, she drove to the district attorney's office, where she met with colleagues she'd known for years. She knew that not all of them were her friends, but she had hoped that professional ethics would at least keep them from turning a blind eye to what was going on. However, her expectations were quickly dashed. When she presented evidence, including videotapes and witness statements, she was met with a cold response. We realize this is a serious charge, but we can't just smear an officer with an impeccable reputation, said one of the deputy prosecutors sitting across the table. Flawless? She almost laughed at the absurdity of the words. You call someone who purposely endangered children and uses his position to humiliate people based on their skin color blameless? The deputy prosecutor averted his eyes, and another officer tried to change the subject by saying that there was insufficient evidence in the case. I brought you video, witnesses, and recordings of his past complaints. Is that not enough evidence for you, or do you just not want to see it? But it was made clear to her that the case could drag on, and the investigation would take longer than she had hoped. It was clearly a way to keep the case quiet. On the way home, her phone rang. It was an anonymous number. On the other end of the line, a man said in a quiet but confident voice, "If you don't stop, you will regret it. This is a warning." Her heart sank for a second, but she restrained herself. "Who are you? What do you want?" she asked, but all she heard in response was a dial tone. She knew they were not empty threats. Her opponents were willing to do anything to preserve her officer's reputation and protect the system itself. But she couldn't stop. Her son deserved justice. Later that night, she delved into the documents again, trying to find the connection that would prove this officer's actions were not random. And that's when she came across a report that at first looked like a routine office record. However, as she delved deeper into the details, she saw that it was a record of an internal investigation. The report outlined several complaints filed against the officer, including allegations of racist remarks, unwarranted detentions, and abuse of power. Many of those complaints were settled or dismissed for lack of evidence. But one case caught her attention. A teenager who was detained by the same officer last year later missed school because of an emotional breakdown. The parents tried to file a complaint, but the case never went to court. She also found an interesting fact. Every investigation against this officer was overseen by the same person, a captain who was clearly covering for his subordinate. The next morning, she gathered all the documents and called journalists she trusted. She realized that the only way to beat the system was to get public attention. Jaden's story was not going to go unnoticed. By late afternoon, the news was already starting to break. The headlines talked about the officer who had endangered children's lives, the prosecutor who was fighting for the truth, and the system that was trying to cover it all up. Her phone was ringing off the hook, but she knew this was just the beginning. Jaden watched the news with his mother. For the first time in a long time, he felt that the truth might win out. But he also knew that the fight would only get more heated. For when the system becomes defensive, it becomes even more dangerous. The courtroom was full. Every chair was occupied, and journalists with cameras and notebooks stood along the walls, ready to record every detail of this sensational case. Jaden sat next to his mother, his heart racing. Every sound, the footsteps of the lawyers, the rustling of papers, the whispers in the crowd seemed deafening. But he knew this was the day when the truth had to prevail, despite all the pressure. On the other side of the room sat the officer, now in a suit that should have made him look like an upstanding citizen. His lawyer, a well-known defense attorney with a reputation as a master manipulator, sat next to him, looking confidently at the crowd. The officer looked calm, even haughty, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes as his gaze met Jaden's mother's. The trial began with introductory statements. The officer's lawyer stood up first and spoke with pathos, trying to convince the jury that his client was a valiant police officer who was simply trying to maintain order. "My client acted within the scope of his authority," he pronounced as he walked along the jury bench. "He faces difficult decisions every day. Sometimes he has to take unpopular measures for the safety of the public." He looked at the jury, trying to elicit sympathy from them. He then turned to the videotapes, which became the main evidence. These videos presented by the prosecution do not convey the whole picture. They are taken out of context. My client was confronted with aggressive behavior from a young man who not only ignored his instructions but also provoked him. Jaden felt the heat flood his face. He wanted to scream that it was a lie, but his mother put her hand on his shoulder. She remained unfazed, though her eyes radiated steel. When it was her turn, she stood up with a folder of documents and calmly approached the podium. The whole hall fell silent, waiting for her words. "This case isn't about hard decisions," she began, her voice sounding clear and confident. "It's about abuse of power, about how an officer entrusted with protecting the public decided to use his position to humiliate and threaten." She began presenting evidence. The first video taken by witnesses showed the officer throwing wires into the pool. The footage was accompanied by screaming children and panic in the background. Whispers were heard in the audience. Some viewers even shrieked when they saw it. "That's what really happened," she continued. "The officer was not trying to prevent a disturbance. He created a threat that might not have happened if he had acted within the law." She turned her attention to the testimony. Several people, including the woman who had recorded the video, stood up to confirm their words. Their stories were emotional, and some of them brought tears to the audience. Jaden's mother then presented documents she had found earlier. They contained reports of past complaints against the officer, statements that had been denied or ignored. "This man didn't just make a mistake once," she said, circling the room with her gaze. "This is part of a systematic problem. How many more people have to suffer before someone says enough?" When it was time for the officer to testify, he tried to appear calm and confident, but his answers sounded strained. His attorney tried to minimize the damage by asking questions that were meant to put him in the best light. But Jaden's mother quickly destroyed that strategy by asking direct questions that he evaded. "Why did you feel it was necessary to use electrical wires?" she asked. "I wanted to get their attention," he replied, but his voice was unsure. "To attract attention? Did you realize you could have killed the children?" He hesitated. There was a tense silence in the hall. When Jaden's mother finished, the room was in shock. Her presentation was flawless, her words leaving the officer and his defense without an argument. The reporters recorded every detail, and the jury looked flustered and angry. After several hours of deliberation, the judge addressed the room. Based on the evidence and testimony presented, the jury unanimously concluded. Jaden held his breath. His whole body tensed. In that moment, it felt like his whole world had frozen. "The defendant has been found guilty." The words echoed in the hall. The officer lowered his head, his face ashen gray. Jaden's mother let herself breathe out for the first time. She knew it wasn't the end of the battle, but this day was an important victory. As he left the courtroom, Jaden saw a crowd of reporters rushing in with questions, but his mother raised her hand to stop them. "Today, justice has been served," she said. "But this case shows that the system needs to change. We must not stop." Jaden looked at her with pride. He knew their fight had only just begun, but together they could change the world. The day the verdict was handed down was the beginning of a new reality for everyone involved in this story. The officer whose actions were deemed illegal was fired from the police force and faced criminal charges. His name became a symbol of abuse of power, and photos taken in the courtroom went viral on news feeds. People argued on social media, some defending him as a victim of the system, others calling him the embodiment of its darkest side. But for Jaden, this was not a victory to celebrate. Although he had seen justice served, The scars of the experience remained deep inside. Every time he heard the sound of a police siren or spotted a patrol car, his body tensed. He had nightmares about electric sparks in the pool, about the cold, contemptuous stare of the officer who threw words like daggers into his face. Jaden's mother, though she won in court, knew there was a long road ahead. This story wasn't unique. The document she found hid dozens of similar cases that had never made it to trial. She realized that their family was just another in a long line of victims of a system that protects its representatives even when they are clearly breaking the law. A week after the trial, he and Jaden returned to the pool. It was empty this time. The water, so peaceful in appearance, no longer seemed a source of joy to him. He walked to the edge and looked down. His reflection trembled on the surface of the water, and in his eyes he saw not only himself, but the fear, the humiliation, the rage he had experienced. He took a deep breath and sat down next to his mother, who was staring at the water in silence. "I don't think I can forget it," he said without taking his eyes off the water. "You don't have to," she replied. Her voice was soft but firm. "You can't forget things like that, but you can use it to grow stronger, to change what seems unchangeable." He nodded, though he still felt empty inside. In the days that followed, news of their case began to fade. The system tried to shut the episode down, continuing to operate as it always had. But now its secrets were a little more apparent. People began to ask questions. Journalists published investigations about other cases that had previously been hushed up. Jaden's mother began working to create an organization that would advocate for the rights of victims of police brutality. Her phone was ringing off the hook with calls from other parents who had been through similar things. They wanted justice, but many of them were afraid of a system that was designed to break those who tried to fight back. For Jaden, returning to normal life was a long and painful process. He returned to school, but he felt like an outsider, even among his friends. He had to fight the anger that flared up inside him when he remembered how the officer had humiliated him in front of everyone. Sometimes he wondered, what if his mother hadn't been a prosecutor? What if no one had fought for him? The answers to these questions made him feel even heavier. But along with the pain came a new understanding. He started reading about human rights, about systemic injustice, about movements that were changing the world. He realized that his life story could be part of something bigger. He wanted no one else to feel what he felt that day at the pool. A few months after the trial, he and his mother attended a rally against police violence. Jaden held a banner that read, "Justice should not be rare." He could feel the determination growing inside him. It was only the first step, but he knew he wouldn't stay silent any longer. The story of Jaden and his family did not end in the courtroom. It was a tragedy that left deep wounds, but in it, hope was born. Hope that the system that has suppressed voices for centuries will one day be broken. Hope that people like him would never be alone again. Hope that the truth has power after all, if you fight for it to the end. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced racism or injustice in your life? Your stories are very important to us, and we value each and every one of you. Your voices help us shine a light on issues like this and work toward solutions. Subscribe to our channel and like us to support us, and don't miss new stories. We wish you a good day and justice in every step you take.